Welcome, everyone. My name is Anna Grzma-Abusa. I'm director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. And it's today my great pleasure and honor to welcome Larry Diamond to WCED today. He's one of the foremost analysts and practitioners of democracy and democracy assistance. He's currently a fellow at the Hoover Institution, a professor of political science and sociology at Stanford University, and the director of the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. He has served as an advisor and an expert at various governmental and non-governmental agencies, ranging from the US State Department to the World Bank to the United Nations. In 2004, he was senior advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, and subsequently authored an authoritative and critical account of America's Iraq strategy in a book entitled Squandered Victory: The American Occupation and the Bungled Effort to Bring Democracy to Iraq. The book is only one of the many he has written. He's the author of 5 books and dozens of articles. He has also founded the Journal of Democracy, which is the premier outlet, the premier publication, Democratization Studies. And so today, we're delighted that Larry brings his enormous expertise and analytical insight to us today in a talk entitled, in a characteristically provocative style, Is Democracy in Decline? Welcome.
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to begin by thanking Anna for her very warm and embracing introduction. And thank you all for coming on this chilly Ann Arbor afternoon. But if I could come here from California, I guess you could come here from across campus. So this lecture is based on an article that I published recently in the January issue of the Journal of Democracy. The title of that article is Facing Up to the Democratic Recession. So there's an answer to the question I've posed. The title of the whole issue, which is our 25th anniversary issue of the Journal of Democracy, is this title, Is Democracy in Decline? And I think we could ask this question in 2 ways. First of all, do we see any perceptible decline in the extraordinary pace of democratic expansion that the world has experienced from 1974 until whatever date you want to assign to the continuation of it? And that's kind of a more limited and technical, analytic, and even measurement question that I will get into today. But then there's like the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. There is the broader question of whether democracy as an idea, democracy as a global norm, is in decline. Maybe it is that this great third wave of democratic expansion that began in 1974, that picked up steam in the late 70s in Latin America, and then early 80s, spreading out to Asia, and then, of course, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, became a much more global phenomenon in the 1990s, around the time that Samuel Huntington published his very seminal book, The Third Wave: Global Democratization in the Late 20th Century. Maybe we've had a good run, but it's not where the world really can sustainably be, given the clash of civilizations, Huntington 2.0 or 3.0, or however you want to frame it. So there are a lot of questions to answer. I won't be able to do them all in 45 or 50 minutes, but let me try and get to as much of it as possible, and then I really will look forward to your questions and comments. First of all, well, here's the punchline. I think there was a remarkable period of steady and unprecedented expansion of democracy between 1974 and 2005. And the argument I make empirically in this essay is that it really pretty much leveled off around then and came to a halt, and has been since around 2005, 2006, in a mild state of recession. And what worries me is I think the potential for it to become much more severe. I'm not going to spend a lot of time defining electoral democracy, But I do use democracy here in two senses, and I do find it necessary and important to make the distinction between them. I think we can think of democracy as a dichotomous variable in which either there exists or there does not exist a means for people to choose and replace their political leaders in regular, meaningful, free and fair elections. And of course, with some degree of freedom of speech and assembly and the press and so on, in order for elections to be free and fair. Meaningful means that they have to be, they have to confer real power to govern on those who are elected. So Morocco doesn't count. If they did have free and fair elections in Iran, which they don't, it wouldn't count because the ultimate power is not the president of Iran today. It's the unelected supreme leader and so on. So electoral democracy, yes or no? This is something I've tried to measure for a long time now. And then we can think of democracy as a continuum. And at some point along the spectrum toward a higher quality of democracy, we can distinguish a group of democracies that we call liberal democracies, not because they have neoliberal economic policies or not. That's a separate empirical question. But because democracy is deeper in a number of respects. First of all, and this gets into an article I wrote some years ago with Leonardo Morlino, and then an edited book on the quality of democracy, that there's popular sovereignty that's deep and genuine in terms of the people ruling and having control over government, and there being high and vigorous levels of political competition, participation, vertical accountability, which means that the people can control their leaders, and responsiveness of government to the wishes of the people. Then there being liberal government in the sense of protection for minority rights, freedom of the individual, again, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, freedom to organize trade unions, all of this. That there be reasonably high levels of political equality. So it'll never be the case, I think, in our lives or in the foreseeable future, that we will have perfect political equality in terms of all citizens having equal ability to influence decisions. But hey, it'd be nice to have at least a somewhat of a floor under political equality or inequality, so it doesn't become too extreme, and a ceiling so you don't have the obscene reality, in my opinion, in the United States today, where some powerful individuals can spend, what is it going to be now, $900 million they've announced in the next election cycle to try and shape electoral outcomes to their tastes. And then a civic culture of tolerance, mutual respect, participation, and respect for minority rights and things like that. The third element is what Guillermo O'Donnell calls the Republican element of democracy in terms of the ideal of a republic that is well governed with the rule of law, vigorous horizontal accountability where different institutions, whether they be the judiciary or legislative committees or a counter-corruption commission or an ombudsman structure, can monitor others, and a generally effective state. So that's the architecture of democratic quality, and here some of the elements of that and how it can be measured. I don't want to dwell on this now, but I guess you'll have the slides or I can make them available to you. So here are the trends. We can actually measure how many democracies there have been in the world in a number of different ways, both democracy and liberal democracy. And for a number of years now, not going back to 1974, but for a number of years now, Freedom House, which how many of you have heard of Freedom House? It's an NGO and a think tank based in New York and Washington that does some democracy assistance work, but is most famous for its annual survey since 1972-73 of freedom in the world, where every year, it's important for me to explain this for people who don't know, they measure levels of freedom in the world on two dimensions: political rights, such as rights to contest and free and fair elections, and civil liberties, such as freedom of the speech and freedom of the press. I will return to the scales and how to think about them and critically assess them a little bit later, but what's important to know now is that they aggregate all their different scores into two sets of numbers, one for political rights and the other for civil liberties. And each of those two scales ranges from 1, which is most free, to 7, which is most repressive or least democratic. And they've been doing that every year since 1972 through the end of last year. And so for liberal democracy, I've taken a fairly simple and straightforward, not to me fully satisfying, but direct and I'd say defensible decision that any country that gets a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale of political rights and a 1 or a 2 on the 7-point scale of civil liberties, that's what I will take as an empirical indicator of liberal democracy. This is not equivalent to purely to a number or statistic you may often hear from Freedom House, which is the number of free, quote unquote, states in the world, because that is a number where a 2 and a 3, usually 2 on political rights, 3 on civil liberties, is adequate to qualify as a free state. And if you take all the states in the world that score a 3 on civil liberties and look at the levels of police brutality, the levels of judicial corruption, the levels of violation of minority rights, and other frequent smoking guns that land them not in the 2 but in the 3 category, I don't think there's any way you could call that liberal. But in any case, you can see here the trends in liberal democracy. Now, what about democracy, just purely electoral democracy, which includes both liberal and illiberal democracies? Well, I'm just trying to measure the number of countries in the world where people can choose and replace their leaders in regular, free, fair, and meaningful elections. And Freedom House has a 4-part description of that that is pretty good. So I've gone and taken all the countries that they classify as electoral democracies since they started doing this in the 1990s. I went painfully back and made my own judgments for the others, and that's how I wound up with this statistic here, basically a combination. I will just say one last thing, and it's not unimportant. I think Freedom House sometimes is a little too generous in coding countries as electoral democracies. My colleagues, who have a somewhat different perspective on some of the issues that I'm going to present here than me, and who have also published a separate article in the January 2015 Journal of Democracy, Steve Levitsky and Lucan Wei, have an even more kind of dramatic view on this. They think many of the countries that Freedom House calls democracies are really only competitive authoritarian regimes. And so they think there has not been a democratic recession because many of the countries that we think were failures of democracy over the last 10, 15 years and so on never were democracies in the first place. I'm somewhere in between the two, but I will simply say that over the last 10, 15 years, I found it necessary, usually in any randomly chosen year, to reduce by 2 or 3, in one year I think it was 8, the number of countries that Freedom House classified as electoral democracies simply because I thought it was too generous. They didn't downgrade Russia from the status of an electoral democracy to a non-democracy until 2004. And if you follow what Putin did, I don't think it took much time for him after becoming president, or at least being elected president in 2000, to utterly decimate what you might not even recognize as having been democracy in the 1990s, but at least it looked a lot closer to it than it did soon after Putin was elected, and maybe even slightly before when he took office. So with that, you can see two things. Number one, that democracy, as Huntington notes, and others have expanded very gradually during the early part of the third wave, and then there was, in 1989, this momentous turning point in world history where we saw this dramatic jump, not only because of the expansion of democracy in Central and Eastern Europe, but because of the dramatic expansion of democracy in Sub-Saharan Africa as well, around this very time when the wall came down and communism as an important form of government in the world predominantly came to an end. And then you can see that it basically leveled off around the early 1990s, and the percentage of states that were democracies increased, but much more minimally, to about 61% of all the states in the world. Then it decreased to around 57, 58%. In other words, you see the signs of a slight democratic recession here. And then what? Well, I wake up in late December, no, early January. I received the draft of the new Freedom in the World report, which we publish every year in the Journal of Democracy in April. So our version will come out in April of this year, but they've already released it on their website. And I see that there are 5 new democracies in the world, and we're back up to 62% of the world's states. Now just lay that aside and come back to these 5 states in a few minutes, because I think it underscores the challenges in classification and analysis. With respect to liberal democracies, you see that the percentage of states that are liberal democracies peaked at 41% around 2005 and have leveled off since, and are, basically there's been virtually no change. Now, one of the important things to understand, and it gets into which countries became democracies in 2014 according to Freedom House, is that there's actually a very big difference in the frequency or presence of electoral democracy and of liberal democracy if you break it up in this simple and crude way by population size. Countries under 1 million population and countries over 1 million population. And you don't need me to put the laser gun on here to see the obvious point that countries with populations of 1 million or less are much more likely to be democracies than countries over 1 million. And indeed, the gap has become much more dramatic. By 2014, in part thanks to what I'm about to show you in a minute, 90% of all these micro-states in the world are electoral democracies. And only 55% of the larger states in the world are electoral democracies. So you can see, actually, there has been a decline in the instance of democracy since 2005 among states of basically larger than 1 million people. And if we look at liberal democracy, we see that the frequency is twice as high in countries that are micro-states, small countries, less than 1 million people, compared to countries that are over 1 million. Now, this is actually a whole different and extremely interesting issue. I actually wrote a chapter of a book I did about 15 years ago on size and democracy, kind of picking up on that famous little book that Robert Dahl did about 35 years ago. But we can come back to this later if you're interested. The point is, if you just do this simple exercise in terms of population size, the trends are, and the story is a little more sobering than if you look at all countries in the world. And here you see the trends in terms of the growth of democracy in the world by looking only at countries of populations over 1 million. And again, you see the story that keeps seeping into my slides, that 2005, 2006 was a kind of inflection point. And since then, we've been ebbing back. I don't want to overstate it. It's not a crisis. It is not what Huntington called, in terms of looking at the trajectory of the previous two democratic waves, a reverse wave of democratic breakdowns. But it is a stagnation and at least mild recession. We see this as well in terms of trends in freedom in the world. The red line on top is looking at all countries in the world. The blue line is below is looking at developing and post-communist countries only. But the same thing. Levels of freedom peaked around, same point, around 2005, 2006. And the ebbing back since then has been mild, I grant you, but perceptible. And you'll see a kind of more alarming way of presenting this, in a moment, because some countries have continued to move forward, become freer, but the predominant trend has been toward regression. I won't test you on this, and it's not a subway system, but these are the regional trends between 1974 and 2013 in terms of average levels of freedom in the world, averaging now the scales of political rights and civil liberties into one common scale. And what you can see here is, of course, what you can imagine, that Central and Eastern Europe here, I'm sorry, these two, the way this got done, are a little bit harder to separate. But this blue line here is Central and Eastern Europe. And if you get the two lines, Sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Eastern Europe, confused, all you need to do is trace them and see which winds up with the highest score of any of the 6 regions outside of Western Europe, North America, and so on. And you can see the dramatic transformation, which Anna could explain much better than me, of Central and Eastern Europe, around 1989. But the point is not only that it took this immediate and dramatic transformative jump, but that it held it and more or less consolidated it. Latin America and the Caribbean improved somewhat more incrementally, but has also continued to hold much higher levels of freedom. Asia Pacific has been a much more modest and gradual period of change. Africa improved dramatically after the fall of the wall and has been slipping back since. Same story with the former Soviet Union. And the orange line is the Middle East and North Africa, and there the Arab Spring imploded, and we'll talk about that briefly. We've come to a point, if you just want to take a snapshot of this change, where by now, in January of 2015, according to the latest data of Freedom House, as I've slightly adjusted it, we have a situation which has been the situation in the world for about 20 years, very reassuringly, very encouragingly, where democracy is now the predominant form of government in the world. That is the majority of states in the world, and even more modestly, the majority of states in the world above 1 million population are at least electoral democracies. And where there is a critical mass of democracies everywhere in the world except the bottom pair of bars, the far right row of bars, red and blue, for Middle East and North Africa. Everywhere else, there's at least a critical mass of democracies, 1/3 or more in every other region. So if you look at just the red bars, which are electoral democracy, almost 9 of every 10 states in Latin America and the Caribbean, not including Venezuela, not including Haiti, not including Nicaragua, are electoral democracies. About 2/3 of the combined post-communist states, Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, about half of the states in Asia, of course Pacific Island because they're all under, or virtually all under 1 million population, and now about 37% of the states in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the light blue bar is liberal democracy. I will say there was a time when I was giving this lecture when this bar here for Sub-Saharan Africa was very near 50%. And Africa has been the region of the world with the biggest regression, most visible regression of democracy, and I want to talk about why. So let's come to the democratic recession. Why, from a standpoint of empirical assessment, do I say there's been a democratic recession that's been unfolding for about the last 8 or 9 years now? What are the elements of it? Well, number one, the number of democracies peaked in 2005 at about 61.5%. And since then, it's either been flat, it's declined, it's come back up in the last year, but it's come back up in the last year, first of all, to about the same level it's been at, and second of all, with a progression of new democracies that I think are all highly questionable. And as I'll explain in a minute, I don't know enough about these countries to feel confident in disqualifying the judgment of Freedom House, but they're all very iffy and they're mainly very small. They are Fiji, Kosovo, Madagascar, Maldives, and Solomon Islands. Now let me say, if you're going to build an argument about the kind of turning back of the democratic recession toward democratic progress on these 5 countries, I think it's kind of on shallow ground and you should be careful. Point number one. Point number two, all 5 of these countries are, I think, kind of in a gray zone in terms of whether you'd really think they're democratic today. The Maldives, my God, after what it's been through with democratic turmoil, you'd have to question how free and fair the elections recently have been. Fiji, after a long period of military intervention. In any case, if they're democracies with a lot of problems. 3 of them are in populations under 1 million. One, Kosovo, not much over, and Madagascar, much bigger, but also very troubled. So I leave them. I've been very kind of conservative and not overruling Freedom House in my count unless I was confident of it, but it's still a kind of dicey problem. Second, what we do know is if you just look at the Freedom House judgments, we've had 9 consecutive years now in which there have been significantly more countries declining in their freedom scores than improving. And, you know, the balance between improving countries and declining countries has been very dramatic. There's no slide I will show you that depicts the break point, the inflection point, and the difference between the period from 1991 and 2005 from the period 2006 to 2014 as dramatically as this. And so the way to interpret it is simply this. Between 1991, which was kind of the beginning year of the end of the Soviet Union, and 2005, in almost every year in that period, many more countries, usually at least 1.5 times as many, or 2 times as many, or 2.5 times as many, and in 1 year, 3 times as many countries improved their freedom score as saw a decline in freedom. So gainers in freedom greatly outstripped losers. And beginning in 2006, the pattern simply reversed. And between 2006 and 2014, in virtually every single year, there have been many more countries declining in freedom than gaining, and usually the negative ratio has been 2 to 1 or worse. The third element is that there has been a rising pace of breakdowns of democracy, either as a result of a blatant executive seizure of power, a military coup, or a gradual suffocation of democratic institutions and norms to a point which I think, for example, Turkey has reached at some point in the last few years, not later than last year, where we can no longer say these countries are democratic. And the rate of democratic breakdown since 2000 has been nearly twice the pace of the preceding 12 years. There have been, I count, you can dispute it because first of all, you have to decide whether these countries were democracies in the first place, and then you have to decide whether they're still democracies or not today. But, you know, we could dispute on the margins. The point is, by any measure, I think there have been a lot of democratic breakdowns. And in any case, I'm trying to be consistent in my criteria as to what is a democracy and what is not a democracy. And by those criteria, the rate of breakdown during the first decade of the third wave, 74 to 83, was 15%. And then it fell to 7%. And then it increased to 10%. And over the last decade or so, it's been 14% of all the democracies that have existed in these last now 11 years have failed. And just as a note, so that we can keep our sobriety here, during this period, this 40-year period of the third wave, 30% of all the democracies that have existed in this period, in some countries like Thailand, more than once, have failed. And if you remove the advanced industrial democracies, Japan, Australia, the US, Germany, Netherlands, and so on and so forth, the rate of failure among all the other democracies in the world has been 37%, which is to say, you know, democracy, it's not an easy system to maintain. And even in this period of democratic expansion, there's been quite a significant failure rate. These are the democracies. I count 30 of them in which there was a breakdown of democracy, maybe not all of them, but a characteristic sample, and no return to democracy these are the 30 countries. There was a breakdown of democracy at some point, and then a return of democracy at some point. And I'm including countries like Madagascar and Maldives, where I'm a little bit suspicious of the return. These are the countries, 22 of them, where there was a breakdown and there has not been a return to democracy by, it should say, the beginning of 2015. All right, now if you look at Africa alone, again, you don't want to say that it's been too alarming, but you can see the erosion here. What I find particularly interesting is the substantial increase in the number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are not even making any pretense any longer of what they're doing, that are not even competitive authoritarian, that either don't hold multi-party elections at all or hold them in such a way that, you know, there's not even, you know, a chance for the opposition to get some number of seats in parliament or some share of the presidential vote. I might add, if you go back a little bit, this number of 21 democracies in the world, which seems the highest point on this slide, if you add electoral democracy and liberal democracy, it rises to about 23 of what was then 48, and that's why I say there was a period of time when it looked like virtually half the countries in Africa were democracies. We're well below that now. So this answers a question about trends, but it also answers a question about why. And I'd say it's probably the single most important slide that I have to show you. So please let me take a little bit of time to explain it. The Freedom House scales of political rights and civil liberties do not only measure political rights of opposition and contestation and civil liberties like freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and so on. Embedded in each of these two scales in ways that I would recommend that any of the graduate students here who are going into careers in political science try to avoid as conceptual clutter. Embedded in each of these two scales are also measures of rule of law, control of corruption, transparency, and good governance. I don't think this is a good idea as a conceptual structure. So what I did, once Freedom House started releasing for 2005 and every year since then, the category scores of these two scales, not just the aggregated scores, which add up to 40 points for civil liberties and 60 points for 40 points for political rights and 60 points for civil liberties. What I did was strip away the components that measure rule of law and control of corruption and accountability, and I put them in a separate measure. Then I standardized each of these three scales on a range of variation from 0 to 1. So that's what you're seeing now. And what you see is two things that are generally repeated in almost every region. Number one, civil liberties and political rights are well above the levels of transparency and the rule of law. And number two, the most dramatic deterioration, or at least one of the most dramatic trajectories of deterioration, has been on the measure of transparency and rule of law. So civil liberties, political rights, and transparency and rule of law. And I think this not only is a sign of the democratic recession, but it helps us to understand why there is a democratic recession. A lot of other research that I won't say I've done, but I've tried to consume and make sense of, particularly public opinion survey research, which in the last 10 years I actually have been involved in, particularly with the Asian Barometer, shows, I think, decisively, and actually Central and Eastern Europe with the work of Stephen White and Richard Rose and his colleagues were among the first regions for it to be apparent, is that people actually care a lot about the political performance of democracy. We tend to think it runs very heavily in the work of Adam Przeworski and his colleagues, and all the way back to the work of my mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset, that there's a strong relationship between the economic performance of democracy and its sustainability or legitimacy. And that's true, I think there is. But actually, the public opinion survey data show that people care at least as much, and maybe in the near term even more, about the political performance of democracy. And to put it most crudely, if at the risk of tautology, they care about democracy governing democratically. And the thing that will most unravel democratic faith and legitimacy on the part of the people, certainly trust, is evidence that rulers are not being democratic. They're not being transparent. They're not being accountable. They're rigging elections, or they're just feathering their own nest. And so when you've got deterioration in that, it kind of destabilizes the whole thing, and often also is a concomitant of tampering with the political process in order to maintain power. Because why wouldn't you want to maintain power if it's not just giving you the gratification of being able to set your country on the right course for development, but it's also making you rich in the process. These are the figures for the post-communist states. And here, again, you see, while the trajectory from the peak has been downward, The other point to stress is, again, and in a way even more dramatically, these countries score much worse on the transparency rule of law scale than they do on political rights and civil liberties. So what else? There's been incremental erosion of democracy in Latin America. I mean, I don't know if any of you saw the news about the arrest of the elected mayor of Caracas a few days ago. I mean, Maduro at this point, Nicolas Maduro, the successor to Chavez, is, you know, just, I think, panicking into deeper and ever more blatant authoritarianism. But you can see the trends. I still count Bolivia and Ecuador as democracies, but there's so much pressure on the opposition there, and so many subtle and not so subtle methods of victimizing them that, you know, it's increasingly hard to classify these countries as democracies. Not that there aren't problems with other regimes in the region as well. Anyway, during this period where I think there's been a democratic recession, there's been somewhat more deterioration than improvement in levels of freedom, and of course much more the wrong balance in Africa. And then the Arab freeze. It looked so good in 2011, so hopeful, so promising. And in almost every country except one, Tunisia, things are now demonstrably worse than they were, or they were seen to be headed in 2011. So Tunisia has emerged as the first Arab democracy, at least since Lebanon in the 1970s. I actually think that is a development of absolutely huge importance that we should bet on significantly. But Syria is in civil war. Yemen is headed towards civil war, state failure. Libya is a failed state. Egypt has a level of authoritarianism seriously deeper and more abusive than anything that existed under the 29-year rule of Mubarak. The Arab Spring was brutally crushed in Bahrain with the assistance of Saudi troops, and so on and so forth. And so many Arab regimes now are actually worse in their levels of freedom now than they were back then. So is there an emerging crisis of democracy? Well, here are some of the other things that worry me. One is that we've seen, which I talk about in the article, we've seen a resurgence of authoritarian regimes that seem to be adapting and learning, unfortunately. You know, there's been a lot of innovation by democracy assistance actors, by civil societies, social movements, and so on. Well, you know, learning can occur by all sides in this struggle for freedom and democracy. And these regimes are fighting for their lives and the wealth that they have been extracting from their society. And they are learning, and they are developing very sophisticated tools and methods, innovations, cooperations that are containing social movements for democratic change and preempting the kind of public movements like the Orange Revolution, the recent Maidan protests, and so on. And if you see Russia sliding ever and ever deeper toward a nakedly authoritarian state, which it is, one reason why is, you know, Vladimir Putin is obsessed to a level of pathological paranoia about the color revolutions and the possibility, which was incipient after the stolen parliamentary elections in the fall of 2011, that what happened to Yanukovych twice might happen in Ukraine, might happen to him. Secondly, you know, there are a lot of other reasons for worrying about this kind of resurgence of authoritarianism, and one of them has to do with the expanding power and kind of global prestige of being kind of assertive, self-confident outwardly dynamic countries of particularly China, but also Russia, and the growing use by many of these regimes, not just those two, but Iran, Ethiopia, a great many others, of a growing architecture of legal tools for suppressing civil society and criminalizing international flows of cross-border assistance to democratic actors, civil society organizations, human rights groups, think tanks, and so on. And then you've got the troubles of our own democracies in the European Union and the United States, which I can speak about more, but which I think have been very subversive of the democratic momentum in the world. And ongoing crises of democracy that have led to a military coup all over again in Thailand, now a project of the military in Thailand to create a new constitution, which they're in the process of doing now, which will try to contain democracy and permanently prevent a new kind of democratic majority from emerging to change the system again. That's their ambition. Turkey, which I've spoken about. Bangladesh, where there has been a suspension of democracy as a result of an election which the opposition boycotted because they thought, I think with some rationale, that the circumstances for a free and fair election had been taken away. There is also the phenomenon of hybrid democracies, where I would argue that most of these cases, gray zone countries, they're not really democracies if they ever were. And in the case of Hungary, okay, it's probably a democracy, but it started, you know, in the framework of the European Union as quite a liberal democracy, and under Viktor Orban, the assault on liberalism and on constraints, on the institutional constraints on his power and the power of his ruling party have just been stunning. And the inefficacy of the European Union in challenging and containing this, I think, has been very, very deeply troubling. So let me conclude with these 5 points. In response to the question of why there's been a democratic recession, which I hope I've shown that anyway, I think there has been, and what can be done about it. Why has democracy been receding? Why is it in danger now? First of all, rule of law and transparency are weak and declining. Rulers want to and do abuse power. If the institutions aren't strong enough to constrain them, they do it more, and then the iterative cycle between control of power and control of wealth accelerates and becomes a kind of iron chain that's unbreakable, because the incentive structures are all about, you know, not only holding on to what you've got, but the fear of being punished and held accountable, which I think is heavily driving what Putin is doing now if somehow you should lose power. This is closely connected with the abuse of power in other respects in terms of institutions, the parliament, the constitutional court, civil society, the media being too weak to constrain incipient abuses of power. And then, obviously, once they go down that road, they want to weaken the constraints further and further, and you get to a point where you have no longer a democracy but an authoritarian regime. Some of this is fed in a number of countries by very severe polarization along some line of identity cleavage, usually religion or ethnicity. It's underlied by very weak and ineffective political institutions, representative institutions such as parties and parliaments, and another way of saying what I said before, systems of horizontal accountability, and fifth, weak economic performance. But there's another dimension to this, and that is that I think the US and the European Union have just lost their nerve and lost their will in terms of defending and promoting democracy. I want to just say one word. I'm not going to show you these slides, which is kind of a shame because that's the more hopeful story. But if I do show them to you, I'll really eclipse the time for discussion. Let me say I'm worried about the near future, but I'm not terribly, deeply, depressingly worried about the longer-term future. And the reason why is if you look at the public opinion survey data, people around the world still want to live in a democracy. And the resilience of this aspiration, even with everything that's going on in the Arab world, in the latest round, the third round of the Arab Barometer, which is partly based here at the University of Michigan, and in the Afro Barometer, which partly began at Michigan State University, has been quite notable and rather surprising, and I'd say substantially uplifting. People are more aware now. They're more connected now. Their consciousness has been changed in a way, and they're not going to be as tolerant of indefinite and abusive authoritarian regimes. And secondly, you know, if you strip away the surface, and in Russia today, it's on the surface. There's nothing to strip away anymore. In China, some considerable stripping away is needed. But if you do some deeper digging, you find that actually no authoritarian regime in the world, I repeat, no authoritarian regime in the world is truly deeply stable. Everyone faces, I think, in the next 20, 30 years, existential challenges. China, I think, sooner than that. And you might say, well, yeah, but if they collapse, it could look more like Libya than Tunisia, and that's true. But the point is that they're not stable, and they're going to either have to move toward democracy by incremental means, or some of them, not necessarily all of them, but some of them will be under growing pressure to democratize. And there's one reason why that I want to note in closing, and that is, again, with deference to my mentor, Seymour Martin Lipset, I do think there is a relationship between economic development and democracy. And no one in my lifetime has better demonstrated this than your colleague here, Ronald Inglehart, and his co-author, Christian Welzel. I think the evidence that as countries as countries develop economically, and that they undergo very significant value change, is very compelling. And obviously, this is partly driven by social change in a variety of ways, change in the class structure, and so on and so forth. But as development happens, people do aspire for more. They want to be treated as citizens. They want to be autonomous. They want more freedom. They want more control over their lives. And they have more tools to try and secure it. And this is why I can't make this claim today. I don't intend to. But I do see the embers emerging. I do see the fragments and foundations emerging of a very, very powerful current in China and in Vietnam. But I mean, China's the big enchilada here in terms of political change in the world. Sorry for mixing regions, if not metaphors. And if that goes, the whole authoritarian global project goes with it. Thank you very much. And so now on to questions, comments. Anybody? Yes?
You classified the United States and Western European governments as liberal democracies. And I wonder if you could address the decline in democracy in the United States with respect to corporate power, to accountability, to surveillance, and in general, the justice system.
Well, the question is about decline of democracy in the United States, and I think you've touched on a number of respects in which there has been decline, but I would cite other ones in addition. So yes, I think our freedom is at risk or is under pressure as a result of the growing architecture of surveillance in the digital age and the pressure that every new or inducement that every new terrorist attack gives to privilege security over freedom. Secondly, I think that the reproduction or reinvention and intensification of political corruption as a result of two factors in particular, but I'm sure there are others, has been alarming. Number one, the growth of the lobbying industry and the ease with which people, including not only our own special interests, but foreign governments, can purchase influence. It is sickening. It is absolutely sickening. And here I just want to note, since you've got the most important expert in the probably history of the world on the Armenian genocide, my friend and colleague Ron Sunni, here on this campus, I'll just give you one example. I know of a Democratic congressman, big D, small d, who represented a district for a long time in the United States. I'm not going to name him, okay? That's my preference. And it probably had a large Armenian population in it, or a large Eastern European or former Soviet population in it. And every year when he was in the Congress, he sponsored a resolution to declare the violence against the Armenians at the end of the Ottoman Empire what most scholars think it was, genocide, full stop. He then retired from Congress. He became a lobbyist, and his firm was hired by the Turkish government, and I believe he was involved in the lobbying, to lobby against the very provision he had passionately argued for virtually every year he was in the Congress. Our Congress is just up for sale now, with the flow of both campaign money and lobbying money into special interests. And, you know, it's mainly a funny book. It's actually a hilariously funny book. But in terms of what it says about this as well, I highly recommend Mark Leibovich's book about Washington, This Town, and its portrait of the lobbying industry. Now, secondly, campaign finance. Two individuals, two brothers, can confidently declare, defiantly declare, well, we've got a lot of money. We'll spend $900 million of it in the next electoral cycle to try and make our, you know, view of the world, and it's obviously special interests, since they're deep into interests that don't want the kind of policies that just might give us a chance of slowing down climate change. So I just don't know where to begin. I think that our democracy is in very serious trouble in a number of respects. One is the problem of state capture and corruption, which I've just articulated. The second is dysfunctionality. I mean, come on, I don't know what's happened today. I think Mitch McConnell has finally come to his senses, or is maybe bringing his colleagues in the Senate to them. But we're going to close down a piece of the government again after we've been through this so many times now. I can tell you, I travel a lot around the world, and there is nothing, there is no single thing that has done more damage to the image of the United States in the world and to the image of our democracy in the world than this stupid, vengeful shutting down of the government and refusal to pass any kind of budget at all just in order to make a political point and hold the whole American government and public edifice hostage to ideological predilections. And, you know, that doesn't get into the lack of competitiveness in our political system, the fact that we have a virtually ironclad two-party duopoly, that if we saw another party system that had such high and cynically conspired barriers to entry erected and, you know, revised and adapted as meticulously as it has been, you know, we would declare it virtually undemocratic if we saw this in another country, or certainly a low-quality democracy. So yeah, I'm very worried. I think we have a lot of work to do. Yeah?
I wonder if you see the declining voter turnout as causal in the things you just talked about, or is symptomatic of the things you just talked about?
I think it's certainly a symptom, and it is very much a problem. And it is an element of what I would characterize as the declining quality, vigor, robustness of American democracy. I'm not sure it's causal because that problem improved in 2008, but we certainly didn't get a big improvement in, well, we did actually for the first 2 years in governability. I mean, there's two ways to fix the problem of ungovernability in the United States. One is to change our institutions in ways so lower the threshold, rather raise the threshold for a filibuster, change the electoral system so you get less polarization, eliminate, my God, we're so long overdue to achieve this, eliminate gerrymandering in the United States by giving the power to redraw election district boundaries to nonpartisan actors, probably commissions. So I favor all of that, and I favor doing very far-reaching things to improve voter participation and other forms of political participation. But I don't think that alone is going to change things. It actually might help, and it might help in two ways. Number one, if you get more voters participating, they might be paying attention in other ways to what's happening in our democracy. But number two, if you look at what happens now in the primary system in the United States, low voter turnout is associated with higher ideological orientation of the winning candidates in primaries, because you get the more ideological candidates who turn out. This is, in short, the Tea Party phenomenon. If you could substantially increase voter turnout, for example, in primaries, more candidates who are somewhat more moderate would win. Or you can do something else I would value, and we had a question on it earlier today in a discussion, and that is change the election system from first past the post to one that would induce moderation or more flexibility in the political process. So you don't have you're not a captive of the two parties. But the other thing, I'll just say this, is sometimes the way these kinds of bitter and paralyzing partisan divisions have been broken in American history is with electoral realignment. And as a result of a surge in voter participation or a change in voter preferences, you get a situation where one party gets unified control of government, and then they govern, they enact changes, and people can modify them, change them, reject them later. Yeah?
Yeah, I do have a question. You know that I have an interest in opening up our political process to third parties, but it in part stems from concern on my part that our living standards, not only in the United States but worldwide, because resource constraints, are not sustainable, and that we're going to see very significant declines in living standards. What would that do to your optimism in the longer term?
It's an interesting question. I don't think the problem is that precisely. I don't think it is that our living standards are bound to decline. I think it is that our living standards are not sustainable at the level of resource intensity and energy intensity that they are now intertwined with or dependent on. And so unless we learn, unless we refashion particularly and most immediately and urgently the way we power our societies, turn on these lights, heat these rooms, move our cars and everything else, then no, it's not sustainable. What's going to happen is we're going to reach the tipping point in terms of climate change. And if you think we got a drought in California, or you think you're having extreme weather here in Ann Arbor, you know, just wait 20 years and you'll find out what extreme weather looks like. There is nothing, and certainly nothing I have presented here having anything to do with regimes that scares me 10% as much as climate change. And so in that sense, I think it's unsustainable and urgently unsustainable in terms of what we need to do. But I don't think that has anything to do with standard of living. I think that if we undergo the energy revolution toward renewable energy, that we must do rapidly, and energy and efficiency and a transformation of battery technology and so on and so forth, I don't think there's any reason why we can't continue to have, you know, steadily improving standards of living. But there is another problem, and this also is beginning to scare me, and that is that a number of social scientists and engineers are now beginning to argue, just to put it, you know, just distill it down. I'm sorry this talk is so depressing. I apologize, but I'm going out for a drink after this, and I would urge you to do so as well. But it does present some challenges. So they're now beginning to argue, actually, the Luddites were right. They were just off by a couple hundred years. In other words, that we're getting to the point of the advance of technology as the basis for production, where labor is becoming intrinsically redundant. And the big thing on the horizon here is the robotics revolution. So here's another challenge for you bright young people out there. If we can't figure out ways to structure work and organize ourselves so that people can be employed meaningfully, you know, then we've really got a problem. And related to that is the growing inequality that seems structurally embedded and almost ineluctable, which has become a very fashionable topic now, but I think rightly so. And that, I think, is the bigger challenge to democracy, to the viability and quality of democracy. Not that that prosperity will evaporate, but that it will be increasingly unevenly distributed. And democracy is not meant to survive on the foundations of deep, growing, and savage income inequality, or in inequalities of wealth, for that matter. And there, I would say, you know, if we're generating sufficient wealth, we know what the tools are, or at least we have a lot of history about some of the tools that can attenuate poverty and inequality. And it's just a question of what our values are in terms of whether we want to implement them or not. Did you have a question, or you want to leave them for dinner?
I'm going to for dinner.
Okay, go ahead.
You've described very persuasively, I would say gut-wrenchingly, the recent decline in the quality of democracy in our country, in the United States. I'm wondering if you look at some of the other traditional, more affluent liberal democracies around the world, in Western Europe and elsewhere, do you see any similar trends, or is the story a little brighter over there?
So I think you have to make some distinctions. I think that the trend in terms of lobbying is evident in some other established old liberal democracies, United Kingdom, for example. There's kind of a scandal emerging now about lobbying in the UK. Anyway, I won't take the time to explain it, but you'll see it in the news. Scandinavia, I think, you know, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Netherlands, not a Scandinavian country, they continue to score very highly in terms of accountability, transparency, and so on. So I don't think it's all of them, but I do think there are problems that are either persistent or in some ways reemerging or taking new forms with influence peddling and maybe soft corruption in other established democracies, not just our own. And of course, there have always been, very serious problems with campaign finance, business control, and frankly, organized crime penetration of politics in Japan. So, we all have our challenges, and some of them are enduring, some of them are new, some of them are taking new forms in the digital age. The digital age provides new tools of transparency and monitoring to counter them. So, at any moment, you confront what the situation is, and you use your energy and organizing skills to try and, change it for the better. Yeah.
So you mentioned towards the end, you started talking about Asia and China, and you said that China has existential challenges they have to face in the coming years. Could you comment on some of those and maybe that ember of hope?
So, the ember of hope for me, embers of hope, are several. Number one, I think the anti-corruption campaign, which is very energetic, very far-reaching, and up till now very popular, so far as I can tell, in China, that has been launched by its relatively new president, Xi Jinping, is a sign of the extraordinary public unease and disenchantment with the just grotesque levels of corruption under Chinese communist rule. It's become a predatory system, just in the absolute pure sense. And so Xi is cracking down on removing a lot of public officials and warning them they better not, drive fancy cars, wear fancy watches, drown themselves in, expensive liquor and so on. And a lot of people have been removed, and it's wildly popular. But I don't know that it's going to change the fundamental character of predatory rule in China because, first of all, it's very personalized. It's basically under his control and that of one of his closest associates. There's an increasing sense that a big part of this campaign is to eliminate rivals or to put the fear of God in everybody else that they better fall in line or they're going to wind up like Bo Xilai. And so if you fall in line with Xi, does that then give you license to basically do this with a little more discretion, but to do it on a big scale? Personally, I think it is impossible, particularly in a big country like China, which I think can never be a Singapore. That is, you will never get the logic and kind of moral code and leadership model and so on of Singapore to work in a country as large and diverse as China. I think it is impossible to control corruption without moving toward democracy and a rule of law. I think that the existential choice that Xi Jinping faces is either to open up the system, to separate the party from the state, separate the party from the judiciary, begin to introduce mechanisms, not multi-party democracy right away. Maybe that's 10 or 15 years down the road, but at least some mechanisms of competition, electoral competition, beyond the level of village elections, which I think are increasingly not meaningful, even irrelevant. And I think when he came into the presidency, he had a choice, maybe between three paths. Do nothing, do the kind of neo-Maoist purification campaign he's embarked on with himself in the new emerging role of Mao, but obviously in a more capitalist vein, or go the Gorbachev route of structural reform. Now, a lot of people in China, Chinese Communist Party, are obsessed with fear, first among them Xi himself, that if they embark on the path of Gorbachev, they will wind up like Gorbachev. They'll open up the system, it will overwhelm them, and they'll fall. I actually think they're wrong about that, because I think that the model of a successful, in terms of its development story, system in China gives the Chinese much more legitimacy and much more space to do gradual democratization, as happened in Taiwan under a Leninist party, than was possible in the Soviet Union, where the rot was just too deep when Gorbachev launched his reforms. So I think Xi has it exactly wrong. I think if they don't open up, they're going to wind up like Gorbachev. But in a different way, I think what's going to happen is that there's going to be a crisis at some point. I don't know what it's going to be. Maybe it's going to be a collapse of the residential real estate market, which is a really serious problem. Massive corruption in that, or the banking system around it. They're trying to address it. I don't know if they can clean it up. Maybe it's going, but what happened in the US in September of 2008, many experts believe is eminently possible in China in terms of just a tanking of the economy with the, rot in the housing market and the banking system along with it being in the lead. Maybe it's going to be an environmental crisis, Beijing running out of water after 5 years of drought before they can get that canal done. Maybe it's going to be some other environmental disaster that reveals the corruption and nepotism in the system. I don't know, but my guess is that the longer they go on without any rule of law reform, without any separation of party and state, party and judiciary, the more they're skating on thin ice and are a disaster waiting to happen. And I will say, I do not wish for this. Even though I don't like any communist party, I'm a Democrat. I'd love to see immediate democratic change in China, but I think democracy will be much more sustainable in China. And there'll be much lower possibility of the kind of chaos we see in some of the Arab Spring countries if the democratization is incremental, gradual, with some kind of initial period of decompression and gradual movement from totally hegemonic party control to what Robert Scalapino called about some other Asian authoritarian regimes like the ones in Taiwan and Korea in the 1980s, authoritarian pluralist. But I don't think it's happening. I think he's revealed himself. I don't think it's going to happen. Okay, if you can ask it in 30 seconds, I will answer it in 30 seconds.
Really quick. Obviously, with the kind of the failure of American nation building in Afghanistan and the failure of American nation building in Iraq, I was very startled to find, and you mentioned it in your talk, that somehow we have made Kosovo an independent nation, like the world needed another landlocked Balkan country. What's your quick evaluation of what's going on in Kosovo?
I just don't know enough to give you an authoritative answer. You should ask Anna or someone here at the Wiser Center who's wiser than me. But I will say I think we should be very cautious in the future about thinking that the answer to nationality conflict is always, the heroic liberation of a captive people into a new state. At some point or another, people got to learn to live with one another. And that's going to involve ethnic and nationality pluralism. And so I think the better bet in most cases, I can't go back, I'm not going to reconstruct the separation of Kosovo and the whole tragedy of the former Yugoslavia, but I am going to say whenever you can intervene early to try and get new institutions of federalism, power sharing, and generation of what Lintz and Stapon have called a state nation, a kind of where there's, there are, the new state architecture creates an identity over which and around which a number of nationality groups are able to have a dual existing loyalty to the state of which they are a member, but to their own national or ethnic identity as well. I think that's a better and more promising formula. Okay, sorry to have been so long-winded.
On that optimistic note.